So I just woke up and immediately I started thinking about two things, my wife and also the internet. And the reason why those things are linked is because yesterday she and I were talking about the gradual change that has happened to the internet, which in some ways hasn't been so gradual. It's been quite rapid of a change at times, but it's all been a part of the same system, which is the let's just say normalization of the internet, where it has become commonplace to post one's face and to center your posts around yourself or your social life or things that are generally valued in the real world, whereas before the internet was more of a place to share jokes, to mess around, to share information at the best of times. And it was more of a playground for people that were aware that the internet wasn't real life. And I think I used to have a kind of naive assumption about the internet becoming more like the real world, because I sort of assumed when I was a little bit younger that if the internet were to become less of a place that people go on to in order to troll and play around and play characters and things of the like, and be anonymous, etc., I was sort of under the assumption that people would take a more empathetic approach to their communication on the internet. But what has ended up happening instead is not only have people not become more empathetic to others on the internet, you have also seen people in real life become less empathetic to one another. And I believe these things are inextricably linked, because when you look at, for example, school bullying, and this is something that my younger sister tells me about quite a bit, going on with the concept of looks maxing and face and these sorts of things, you have these young children's brains being completely molded by these ideas on TikTok and Instagram about beauty, and they are in the process of being subsumed into this propaganda apparatus, because that's what it is. People did not historically think like this, even though there are some people who are religiously dedicated to this idea enough to try to convince you that they did. This modern context in which they have emerged from has made them want to buy all of these different beauty products that are going to actually age them quicker, which is the ironic thing about it, right? You have the prevalence of anti-aging products, makeup, all of these things that are going to folks who are younger and younger, and as they are spending hours putting themselves together to look a certain way, to look like the people under 12 different filters on Instagram, they're of course miserable, because doing all of that for your appearance is not going to fix the hole that is inside of yourself. That is not going to make you suddenly accept yourself and your existence. You have to be okay with just living, with just being who you are. That isn't to say we shouldn't, focus on trying to be cleanly, on getting a nice haircut, or, wearing clothes that you like and things like this. But it's not the most important thing in the world to tack on this extra kind of stuff. Let's say you're really poor, you can't afford the best clothes. Let's say you can't afford to go to the barber right now or whatever. Well, you could probably learn how to do it on your own. But, barring that, it doesn't so much matter that you don't have those extra things right now, right? In the past, somebody might have made a joke about a bad haircut or something, but it wouldn't get you followed around and routinely bullied and constantly ganged up on. But this is a behavior that's becoming normalized even among adults, which is crazy. That's not something that I could have imagined. Growing up where I did, it was the kind of community where everybody knew each other. It was very tightly knit. There wasn't really much of any bullying in my school. There was some, but because everybody's parents knew the other people's parents, and all the kids generally knew each other, maybe from church or something, it wasn't like that. If somebody was bullying somebody else, it's like the normie majority opinion was that's a bad thing and you should stop. And it was very much like if you were caught lying about something, you'd get a big speech from one of the other kids about how that's a sin, and that's gonna take you to hell and it's wrong and all this different stuff. If you were caught being judgmental to somebody else, I remember I got a big speech from one of the kids about how only God judges and you shouldn't judge, things like this. And it isn't to say that, certain people weren't mildly made fun of for, some aspect of their appearance, but that was only the most obvious cases, right? The most, standout cases, and it was mild. It wasn't anything terrible. It wasn't anything cruel. They didn't go in on anybody. And you could even, make a joke back and kind of join in, and it was fine. It wasn't this terrible sort of just cruel thing that you're seeing nowadays. Now, granted, I haven't been to my hometown in a little while, so I don't know what it's like now. I don't know what school there is like now. But, it wouldn't surprise me if people's attitudes significantly changed from when I grew up because of the normalization of showing one's face on the internet and of specifically centering your social media around socializing. I don't want social media. I want anti-social media, But I think I'm sort of straying away from the point here. The broad through line I'm trying to draw by explaining this is there is a tendency among people now to hyperfixate on their appearance and on these surface level aspects of themselves, to the point where they're just hating existing. They're making themselves lonely. They're reducing their own confidence by, creating this feed of constant negativity and constantly comparing themselves to others, and it's being reinforced by the people around them, because the people around them also think that way, and so they're trying to sort of normalize and enforce a standard of behavior which involves making these obsessive comparisons. And so what we've seen is the worst of both worlds. It's not only has the internet gotten worse because there's all these people trying to bring real world problems and standards and judgment, but also the real world has gotten worse because the not anonymity, but the physical distance of the internet makes it to where you cannot get punched for the terrible things that you say on here. And so people as themselves will say all of this really horrific stuff to other people, and then that behavior becomes normalized online, which also then leads to it becoming normalized IRL. Because when the internet was more of this anonymous thing for weirdos, generally speaking, you wouldn't have people bring their World of Warcraft flaming into the real world. You wouldn't have them bringing the stuff they would say on 4chan into the real world, because they had an understanding that it was separate, that would be cringe-worthy to do. And the number one rule on the internet has always been not to be cringe. And now you're sort of seeing a breakdown of that dynamic where, people have become more themselves online, have made the internet more about themselves and these sort of societal standards, but the societal standards have become reinforced, strengthened, and advanced by the physical safety that the internet creates, and also by the the dynamic that the algorithm creates, where it's just going to show you a lot of the same thing over and over and over until you have the perception that that's really what reality is like. And I think filters are a great example of this, but also the types of lives that people portray about themselves on the internet. I think a lot of people portray themselves like a North Korean version of themselves, like somebody who is living nothing but the perfect life, no criticisms of it whatsoever, not of the regime, etc. Smiling and incredible. What you're not seeing in those Facebook posts, Instagram, or YouTube videos is all the arguments that they're having with the people in their family, with their friends, the mistakes that they make, the days where they're not looking so great. Normal aspects of being a human that we've conveniently forgot are just normal aspects of being a human. And so I think the perception that the algorithm creates of humanity has had a hugely negative effect on people, especially developing minds that, don't have any examples to the contrary. And they're surrounded by other developing children who also have this perception of the world that the media has created for them. And it's leading to this negative feedback loop where they're all enforcing this highly judgmental standard, which is, further promoting the use of cosmetics. And I'm sure, that industry is making massive amounts of money off of this. But it's leading to people literally killing themselves. The youth suicide rate going up, instances of mental health issues among youth going up, bullying increasing. And this is something that bears out in the data. It's also something I've observed anecdotally from what my sister has told me. So, looking at this dynamic in its totality, I don't think it's sustainable. I don't think it's good for humanity. And there have been a number of solutions which have been floated, which I don't particularly have an opinion on. Some people claim that we ought to, ban the use of social media or smart devices for, under 16s or whatever. There are obviously some externalities to that with the encroachment of a possible police state, but whatever the solution may be, we really need to have a serious conversation about this as a national culture, especially before it's too late, because a lot of these kids don't know any better. I'm in kind of a weird situation because I didn't have a smartphone until I was pretty well into being 16. That was the first phone I had of any kind. And also, I grew up on the internet, but I grew up on forums. I grew up on websites dedicated to older video games with a lot of people who were much older. And so I didn't really have the same experience as everybody. I used Facebook for a little while when I was a kid, but it was just to follow politics and to follow stuff to do with old video games. And I got off of it because I couldn't really stand the website due to what the algorithm was showing me. And I remember being a kid making videos about this back in like 2016. I was literally 14 years old in 2016. But I made a whole video about how like social media sucks and this is just a huge waste of time. This is still how I feel, but it's been amplified by the societal changes that we've witnessed occur, where social media has played a bigger and bigger role in terms of how people conceive of themselves and how they interact with each other, both online and in the real world. This has come to define so many of our interactions, and I think that's all just normie shit, It's no wonder that you have sort of this group of people on the internet that are attacking what they refer to as raiju, which is a retarded term, and you are incredibly cringeworthy if you use it. But I also think, those people are pushing back against something that is very real. They're pushing back against this kind of neurotic obsession with fitting into a certain mold and with functioning within systems that many of us, myself included, weren't really born knowing the rules to. And they don't necessarily want to operate in a society that desires for them to be subservient. And unfortunately, what we're seeing in so many cases now is people really are becoming subservient. They're becoming subservient to the desires of the algorithm, to the desires of the cosmetic industry, and to the desires of their peers. When really what we should be saying is, don't tread on me. This is my belief, this is my standard, this is what I want, and I will not allow for you to control my mind. If you think it's bad that I wear this, or I look like this, or I believe this, go fuck yourself. I'm better than you, and I can do better than you, and I'll be better off without you. If everybody had that attitude, I think we would be in a much better place, but there is this sort of almost collectivism, this like cultural collectivism that people are attempting to adhere to, where like the nail that sticks out too much gets hammered down. It's like they're enforcing this sort of dystopian Orwellian standard for how we ought to conduct ourselves to one another, right? It's like you got the German Stasi running around, but it's not a government institution. It's just society, right? It's just mass society at its worst. And I've never liked that. I sort of have the advantage of having grown up homeschooled. I didn't have to deal with bullying and peer pressure, so maybe I have a unique perspective on this. But I remember when I went into school, I didn't let the opinions of other people influence how I conducted myself and how I thought. I would argue against it pretty vigorously, and especially in class when contentious issues would be discussed, because of the kind of, community, how do you say this, community feeling that people had about the school. They didn't really want to argue with each other much. They wanted to be agreeable. I was always arguing, I was very, very sure of my points, and I was, putting it all out there. I didn't care what anyone had to say, even though I had some issues with social anxiety and other problems as a kid, it was like, if people, thought differently or didn't like how I looked, it's like, go fuck them, you can go fuck yourself. And that's the attitude I still have. It's like, what other people think just doesn't matter. If people have these problems with you, especially on the internet, you can kind of use it as like a marketing ploy. Like, let's say you're really controversial. Well, that's a lot of publicity that you can get, to potentially market yourself. It doesn't matter. It's like, it's just opinions people have. And that's the attitude I take on this stuff. It's like, there's some level of I don't know how you put it. I don't know if you would call it like a healthy level of sociopathy, or maybe just an antipathy to the concept of communities that you have to have in order to not be controlled by the people around you. But I think we need to have more of that, a kind of independence that Americans are known for, and that many people across the world are known for, to look at the world around them and say, no, I'm going to think what I think. I'm going to live for myself, and I'm not going to have my thoughts defined by everything that's out there. I think we're really far away from that at this point, because many of these social norms and standards are violently enforced not by some rogue government institution, but by us, the people. And it starts really early. So that needs to change. That needs to change. And I think reassessing our relationship to the internet is one of the ways to commence that process. Maybe I wouldn't think these things if I had grown up, going to school for my whole life. I only went for a very brief period of time, and that was after my personality had more or less developed. It was still developing, but it was pretty late into my school time, and there were all these like social standards and norms that people had that I just flagrantly violated. And I got away with so much stuff during school too because I was just so confidently willing to lie and make things up and, get other people to hold the bag or throw them under the bus or whatever, that, it just didn't matter to me. And people would just go along with it because I was the only one really willing to engage in that sort of behavior. And I'm not saying people should be like that. But maybe take a little bit of that ethos, just a little bit, I was kind of on the extreme end of not caring at all about what other people thought. But if I just had a little bit of that, I think I would have been okay. It's weird because people who have that sort of attitude, they're generally thought of as like the people who become school bullies. I was like the anti-school bully. I was the anti-school bully, but also I hated rules and all of the weird rules that people had for each other, and so I wasn't really going to follow along. And I think it's weird because it's almost like the most sensitive people, the people who are the most invested in all of these social norms, are the most likely to hurt a lot of other people around them. It seems like the more you buy into the ideas of society, the more likely you are to treat the people who don't fully buy into some of those ideas with the utmost cruelty. And I don't really know how to change that, right? Like I'm not even talking about the internet so much anymore as much as I'm talking about just like a problem with mass society, with all of this stuff that we've sort of been inculcated into. But I suppose that's a topic for another day. The point that I'm broadly gesturing at here is that the internet has been made worse by this sort of Web3 interest in normifying everything to do with our internet lives, and also real life has been made worse by the fact that the internet is not really an adequate social space. It's one where people feel free to make a great many errors, and those have had consequences on people who take their interactions online very seriously because they see it like real life. And they have brought many of those behaviors that have hurt them into the real world because it's become normalized in their mind. And no, I think we should just keep these things separate. Bring back, more of an emphasis on free and open source software. Bring back the small internet where people have their own websites. Bring back forums. Put a greater restriction on some of this social media stuff, maybe by breaking them up, I don't know. And get people to not take this stuff so seriously. Not put their whole life on here. Actually just live your life out there And then the weirdos like me who stay in their room all the time can have this as kind of our home away from home, where we're not turning it into this big, social game. We're having our anonymity and our fun, but we're also able to effectively live on here by spending a lot of time on here. Um, I suppose there's some, possible contradictions to that, but it's a theory I'm still developing.